In early 1944, the Pacific Ocean was no longer calm. The war had spread across islands like fire across dry grass. Each month, American forces moved closer to Japan. Each month, Tokyo searched for a way to stop them. Japanese leaders believed they had found the answer. They did not plan to defeat the United States quickly. They planned to exhaust it. They believed Americans feared heavy losses. They believed if the cost became too high, the United States would slow down, then stop, then negotiate. Their solution was simple and brutal. They would turn islands into walls. Across the Pacific, Japan selected key islands and transformed them into massive fortresses. Concrete bunkers were poured deep into coral. Thick steel doors sealed tunnels. Huge coastal guns were aimed at the sea. Soldiers trained day and night inside these defenses. These islands were not meant to move. They were meant to endure. Japanese planners imagined American ships appearing on the horizon. They imagined waves of Marines charging beaches under fire. They imagined blood, delay, and despair. They believed the Americans would have no choice, attack the fortress, or stop the war. This belief was not random. It came from history. It came from tradition. It came from a deep trust in fixed defenses and decisive battles. For generations, Japanese military thinking valued the final stand, hold ground, inflict pain, break the enemy's will. One battle had strengthened this belief more than any other: Tarawa. At Tarawa, American forces had attacked straight into heavy defenses. Losses were high. The fighting was brutal. Japanese commanders studied that battle closely. To them, Tarawa was proof. The Americans attack what is defended, so Japan decided to defend everything. In the Marshall Islands, Japanese engineers worked without rest. Islands like WWII and Mill were reinforced until they seemed unbreakable. Each bunker was layered. Each gun position was protected. Each garrison was stocked with supplies. These were not just bases, they were symbols. They were meant to be traps. Japanese commanders believed these islands would grind American forces down piece by piece. Each assault would cost more lives. Each victory would feel hollow. Eventually, the pressure would force the United States to reconsider the war. At the center of this thinking stood Admiral Monzo Akiyama. Akiyama was calm, disciplined, and deeply confident. He believed he understood the American mind. To his staff, he spoke clearly and without doubt. "The Americans are careful," he said. "They follow rules, they attack what stands in their way." His officers agreed, and everything they had seen supported this view, so they prepared for exactly that. But while Japanese commanders poured concrete and steel into their islands, something else was happening far away. Quietly, without explosions. Without visible movement, American intelligence was listening. For months, codebreakers worked in silence. They intercepted Japanese messages. They studied patterns. They pieced together plans that Japanese leaders believed were hidden. And slowly, a different picture appeared. Yes, the outer islands were strong, very strong, but behind them lay something unexpected, a weakness. At the heart of the Marshall Islands sat Kwajalein. To the Japanese, Kwajalein felt safe. It was protected by distance. It sat behind the fortress ring. No enemy would reach it without first smashing through the outer islands. Because of that belief, Kwajalein was treated differently. It was important but not hardened like the others. Many of the people stationed there were not frontline soldiers. They were clerks, engineers, radio operators, support workers. Men trained to run a base, not defend it against a massive invasion. Only a small part of the garrison consisted of combat troops. American planners noticed this immediately, and one man understood what it meant faster than anyone else. Admiral Chester Nimitz. At Pearl Harbor, Nimitz studied maps late into the night. He did not look at islands as symbols, he looked at them as problems. He saw the outer fortresses, he saw the guns, he saw the traps. Then he saw the gap. The Japanese strategy assumed one thing above all else, that the enemy must attack the strongest point. Nimitz questioned that. He asked a dangerous question. What if they did? What if the fortresses were ignored? What if the American fleet simply sailed past them? This idea did not come from recklessness. It came from clarity. Nimitz understood that fortresses only matter if they block movement. If they can be bypassed, they lose their power. At a command meeting, officers expected the usual discussion. WWII, Mill, heavy bombardments, costly landings. Instead, Nimitz pointed beyond them. His finger landed on Kwajalein. The room went quiet. Some officers thought they had misunderstood. Others stared at the map, then back at Nimitz. Bypassing major enemy fortresses was risky. It meant leaving enemy troops behind. It meant trusting speed, timing, and control of the sea. But Nimitz did not hesitate. "We will not fight where they want us to fight," he said. The plan was bold, it was also precise, but boldness alone would not be enough. If Japan realized what was coming too early, they could shift forces. They could reinforce Kwajalein. They could turn the weakness into a wall, so deception became essential. The Americans needed Japan to believe everything was happening exactly as expected. And so the performance began. American ships appeared near the outer islands. Aircraft attacked runways. Battleships fired heavy shells into known fortifications. Recon planes flew low and often. From Japanese observation posts, it looked familiar, predictable. The Americans were softening defenses, just like Tarawa. Japanese officers reported the activity with confidence. They believed the decisive battles were about to begin. The fortresses would do their work. Behind the scenes, however, something very different was happening. Transport ships were gathering far from the bombarded islands. Troops were loading. Supplies were stacked. Routes were planned with careful timing. The real target remained untouched, invisible. As days passed, Japanese commanders did not question the absence of landing craft. They assumed preparation took time. They assumed the Americans were cautious. Every assumption reinforced the trap. By late January, everything was ready. The American fleet began to move, not toward the fortresses, but through the gaps between them, straight toward Kwajalein. The Japanese did not see it coming. For the Japanese commanders stationed on the outer islands, the days before the invasion felt reassuring. Everything looked correct. American planes continued to strike their airfields. Naval guns still fired from a distance. Smoke rose from beaches that Japan had spent months preparing to defend. To them, this was proof. The enemy was behaving exactly as expected. Japanese observers sent steady reports to headquarters. The Americans were cautious. They were slow. They were following the same pattern they always followed. The decisive battle was coming, and it would come here. Inside concrete bunkers, soldiers checked weapons again and again. Ammunition was stacked neatly. Food was rationed carefully. Officers walked inspection routes with calm confidence. These men believed they stood at the center of history. They believed their sacrifice would decide the war. What they did not realize was that history had already moved past them. While shells exploded on the outer islands, the main American force sailed quietly across open water. Ships moved at night. Radio traffic stayed minimal. Navigation was precise. The fleet followed routes Japanese doctrine considered too dangerous and unnecessary. The gaps between the fortresses were wide enough, and no one was watching them closely. Japanese planners had assumed no enemy would dare pass so close without first destroying the guns. The coastal artillery faced outward toward the open ocean. Their barrels were fixed, their fields of fire carefully measured. They were powerful. But they could not turn quickly. As American ships slipped through the channels, those guns remained silent. Not because they lacked ammunition, not because crews were unprepared, but because they were pointing the wrong way. By the time Japanese radar stations noticed unusual movement, it was already too late. Reports came in late and unclear. Ships seen in the lagoon, too many silhouettes, too close. At first, commanders dismissed the reports as errors. Then dawn came. On January 30th, 1944, the sky over Kwajalein began to glow. Japanese officers stepped outside their bunkers expecting distant flashes. They had grown used to hearing explosions far away. They expected another day of waiting while the outer islands absorbed the punishment. Instead, they saw the sea covered in steel. The horizon was no longer empty. It was filled with American warships. Battleships sat heavy on the water. Aircraft carriers stretched across the lagoon. Cruisers and destroyers moved in careful formation. Behind them came transport ships packed with soldiers and equipment. The scale was overwhelming. For several seconds, no one spoke. This was not a raid, this was not a probe. This was an invasion, and it was happening inside the ring Japan believed was secure. Confusion spread fast. Officers shouted orders. Radios crackled with broken messages. Headquarters demanded explanations that no one could give. How had the Americans arrived here? Why had the outer fortresses not stopped them? Why were the guns silent? Inside his bunker, Admiral Akiyama listened to the reports with growing dread. He understood faster than most what this meant. The enemy had not broken the fortress ring. They had ignored it. That realization hit harder than any shell, because it meant the entire strategy was wrong. Akiyama had built his defense around certainty. He had trusted doctrine, he had trusted tradition. He had trusted the idea that the enemy would fight the way he expected. Now the enemy was proving otherwise. American battleships opened fire. The first shells struck with terrible force. The ground shook, concrete cracked, shockwaves rolled through tunnels like thunder trapped underground. Kwajalein had defenses, it had bunkers, it had guns. But it was not built to face this. Many of its structures were administrative, storage, communication, maintenance. They were never meant to absorb direct naval bombardment from close range. Walls collapsed, antennas snapped. Command posts vanished under dust and fire. Communication lines failed one by one. Akiyama watched reports disappear from the board. He knew the truth. The decisive battle Japan had prepared for was happening, but not where they planned. Above the island, American aircraft roared overhead. Bombs fell in patterns, strafing runs cut across open ground, smoke rose everywhere, then came the landing craft. Marines moved toward beaches that barely existed anymore. The shoreline had been reshaped by fire, landmarks were gone, trees were shredded, the air burned the lungs. As the first waves hit, resistance appeared quickly but unevenly. Some Japanese units fought with fierce determination. They charged forward despite the chaos. They fired from shattered positions, they refused to retreat. But many defenders were unprepared for this kind of assault. They were cooks holding rifles, engineers trying to organize defenses under fire, clerks scrambling to find ammunition. They fought bravely, but bravery could not replace preparation. American tanks followed close behind the infantry. Their engines roared through broken terrain. Flamethrower teams moved methodically, clearing bunkers that had survived the bombardment. Every hour changed the situation. Japanese resistance broke into isolated pockets. Leaders were killed or cut off. Orders stopped reaching the front. By the second day, organized defense was collapsing. By the third day, it barely existed. When the fighting ended, the difference was stark. Thousands of Japanese defenders were dead. American losses were far lower than anyone had expected for an island operation of this scale. But the real damage went beyond numbers. The Japanese fortresses still stood. And they were now useless. On WWII, on Mill, on other fortified islands, soldiers waited. They listened for the sounds of battle coming closer. They expected the Americans next. They sharpened bayonets. They prepared final positions. They accepted their fate, but nothing happened. No ships appeared, no shells fell, days passed, then weeks. From their bunkers, they saw American ships moving through the lagoon, convoys sailing past them, close enough to see, too far to reach. At first, commanders assumed this was temporary. Then reality settled in. They had been bypassed. They had not been defeated. They had been abandoned. Supply ships stopped arriving. Orders from Tokyo faded. Food grew scarce. Medicine ran out. The fortresses that were meant to be symbols of strength became cages. Men trained to die in battle now waited in silence. And slowly, another truth emerged. The Americans had not just won a battle. They had changed the war. On the outer islands, the waiting became heavier than combat. Japanese soldiers had trained their entire lives for one moment, the final clash, the decisive stand, the moment where courage and sacrifice would shape history. That moment never arrived. At first, officers tried to maintain routine. Guards were posted on beaches, guns were cleaned daily, patrols marched along empty shorelines, discipline held even as confusion grew. They told the men the Americans would return. They had to. The fortresses were too important to ignore. The logic felt solid, the belief felt safe, but days passed without change. The sea remained quiet, no landing craft appeared. No bombardment followed. Only distant ship movements far beyond gun range. Sometimes smoke rose on the horizon. Sometimes aircraft flew overhead without attacking. The enemy was there, just not interested. This created a kind of fear no training had prepared them for. Soldiers understood combat. They understood death. They even understood defeat. But abandonment was different. On WWII, officers gathered nightly to review the situation. Maps still showed strong positions. Guns were still intact. Ammunition was still stacked, yet none of it mattered. The enemy had slipped around them and struck the heart. And now the heart was gone. Kwajalein had fallen quickly. Reports were fragmentary, but the truth was clear. Command centers destroyed. Communications severed. Supplies captured. Airfields taken. The outer islands were no longer part of a defensive network. They were isolated dots. Tokyo tried to respond. Messages were sent. Orders were issued, but the sea was no longer open. American ships controlled the lanes. Aircraft hunted anything that moved. Resupply became impossible. Each day, rations were reduced slightly. Rice portions shrank. Fresh water became precious. Medical supplies were rationed to the most severe cases. Men grew thinner. Uniforms hung loose. Faces hardened, yet discipline remained. Japanese soldiers continued drills even when strength faded. They stood at attention when officers passed. They saluted. They followed orders. This was not weakness. It was commitment, but commitment could not feed them. As weeks turned into months, the situation worsened. Sickness spread. Wounds healed slowly or not at all. Malnutrition weakened even the strongest soldiers. Some collapsed during patrols. Others could no longer lift heavy equipment. Artillery crews struggled to move shells. Still the guns faced the sea. Still they waited. Inside bunkers, men whispered at night, not of fear but of confusion. They asked questions no one could answer. Why has the enemy not come? Why do they pass us by? Why are we still here? Officers tried to hold morale. They spoke of honor, of patience, of duty. They promised the battle would come. But each promise felt thinner. The American strategy had achieved something unexpected. It had removed purpose. A fortress without an enemy is just concrete. On Kwajalein, the Americans worked quickly. Engineers repaired airfields. Supplies flowed in. Hospitals were built. The island became a hub of movement and power. From there, American aircraft struck deeper into the Pacific, ships refueled, troops reorganized, the war moved forward. And the bypassed islands stayed behind. From the air, American pilots could see them clearly. Long runways, gun emplacements, silent beaches, no movement, no fire. They did not attack. There was no need. Each bypassed garrison consumed Japanese resources without contributing anything to the war effort. They were neutralized without being destroyed. This was not mercy, it was efficiency. American planners understood that every bomb dropped had a cost. Every landing had a price in lives. If an island could be made irrelevant, that was victory enough. The Japanese high command slowly realized the scale of the disaster. The fortress strategy had assumed one thing, that the enemy must fight. The Americans refused, and that refusal broke everything. Reports from the outer islands grew desperate, requests for supplies, requests for evacuation. Requests for permission to attack American positions, most went unanswered. There were no ships to send, there were no planes to spare. Japan's industrial base was stretched thin, fuel was scarce, losses mounted elsewhere. The empire could not afford to rescue men who no longer mattered strategically. That truth settled slowly, painfully. Some commanders wrote letters they knew would never be delivered. Others kept diaries, recording the daily struggle against hunger and illness. They did not describe defeat, they described fading. By late 1944, many garrisons were shadows of their former strength. Men were too weak to patrol. Some could barely stand. Rifles leaned against bunker walls, untouched for weeks. Yet even then they did not surrender, they waited, because waiting was all they had left. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers trained for action found themselves trapped in stillness. Time lost meaning, days blended together, hope shifted from victory to survival, and survival grew harder with each passing week. The fortresses that Japan had built to stop the war had become places where time itself seemed frozen. Meanwhile, American forces moved on, new islands fell, new bases were built, the ring tightened around Japan. Each bypassed fortress became a reminder, not of strength, but of certainty gone wrong. The lesson was spreading even if no one spoke it aloud. Fixed power fails when the enemy moves freely. Walls mean nothing if they can be ignored. On some islands, officers finally understood. They gathered their men and spoke honestly. They admitted the truth. The war would not come to them, they would remain where they were. Some soldiers wept quietly, others stared at the ground. A few nodded as if they had suspected this all along. No one cheered, there was nothing to celebrate. The bypass strategy did more than win battles. It changed how wars would be fought. Mobility replaced rigidity. Intelligence replaced assumption. Choice replaced obligation. And Japan, once so confident in its unbreakable walls, was now paying the price for believing too deeply in them. As 1944 drew to a close, the outer islands remained silent. No guns fired, no ships landed, only the sound of wind over concrete, and the knowledge that the war had moved on without them. As the months passed, the bypassed islands became quiet places of slow collapse. There were no great battles, no dramatic charges, no final explosions. Instead, there was silence, broken only by wind, waves, and the sound of men breathing through hunger. Japanese soldiers had been trained for many things. They had trained for attack, they had trained for defense. They had trained to endure pain and fear, they had not trained to be ignored. On islands like WWII and Mill, officers tried to keep order. They maintained schedules. They enforced discipline. They required men to shave, to clean weapons, to stand watch, even when there was nothing to watch for. Routine was the only thing holding the units together. Food was the greatest problem. Rice stocks ran low first. Then canned goods disappeared. Fresh water became tightly controlled. Men were ordered to drink less, to work less, to speak less. Some began fishing from shore. Others trapped birds. Some dug for roots or boiled leaves they hoped were safe. It was never enough. Medical officers faced impossible choices. Who received medicine, who did not? Simple wounds became deadly. Fever spread easily among weakened bodies, yet surrender was never discussed, not openly. Japanese doctrine did not allow it. Honor demanded endurance, even when endurance led only to slow death. On some islands, commanders ordered men to destroy unnecessary equipment. Radios were dismantled to save power. Vehicles were abandoned. Guns were left in place but rarely fired. Why fire at empty sea? Every shot wasted precious strength. Morale shifted in quiet ways. Men stopped talking about victory. They stopped asking when the Americans would arrive. Instead, they spoke of home, of childhood, of food. Rice became a dream. The Americans, meanwhile, were moving with purpose. From Kwajalein, they launched operations deeper into the Pacific. Airfields buzzed with activity. Ships came and went. Supplies flowed freely. The contrast was cruel. From their bunkers, Japanese soldiers could sometimes see American aircraft passing overhead. They flew high and fast, heading west. They did not look down. Those planes were a reminder. The war was continuing without them. American intelligence monitored the bypassed islands carefully. Recon flights confirmed what planners expected. No movement, no construction, no signs of threat. The fortresses were neutralized, not destroyed, neutralized. This word mattered. It meant the enemy was no longer relevant. That idea spread through American command circles. Why fight what can be ignored? Why pay in blood for ground that no longer matters? The bypass strategy saved lives. It preserved momentum. It broke the enemy's plan without touching every position, and it revealed a deeper truth. War was no longer about smashing walls. It was about controlling movement. Japanese leaders struggled to accept this. Reports from isolated garrisons piled up. Requests grew more desperate. Some officers begged for permission to launch attacks, even suicide attacks, just to regain purpose. Most requests were denied. There were no ships, no fuel, no air cover. The empire was shrinking. At the highest levels, Japanese planners began to understand what had happened. The fortress strategy depended on certainty, on forcing the enemy into predictable choices. The Americans had refused. And in refusing, they had turned Japan's greatest strength into a weakness. A fortress only works if the enemy needs it. By late 1944, many isolated garrisons were beyond saving. Men died quietly in bunkers. Others collapsed during routine tasks. Graves were dug by hand, then left unmarked. Officers continued to write reports even when there was no one left to read them. They recorded rations, they recorded deaths, they recorded weather. It was all they could do. Some soldiers began to wonder if the war would end before they did. Others believed they would never leave the island alive. Time became strange, days blurred together. Hope did not disappear completely. It thinned. On Kwajalein, American troops prepared for the next phase of the war. They trained, they repaired equipment, they rested. For many, the victory there felt almost unreal. Losses had been low, success had been fast. Some Marines felt uneasy. They had expected a brutal fight like Tarawa. Instead, they had walked through shattered defenses. They had seen the power of planning and deception. Officers explained it clearly. "We won because we chose where to fight," they said. That lesson would stay with them. Across the Pacific, news of the bypass strategy spread among Allied forces. It changed expectations, it changed planning, it changed how future operations would be shaped. Static defense was no longer enough. Flexibility became essential. For the Japanese soldiers left behind, none of this mattered. They lived each day with shrinking strength. Some kept journals, others stopped writing altogether. One common thought appeared again and again: the enemy did not defeat us, they left us behind. That thought was harder to bear than defeat. By the end of the year, many bypassed islands were silent. Guns rusted in place, bunkers filled with dust. Patrol paths vanished under vines. Nature reclaimed what war had frozen. The fortresses still stood, but they meant nothing. They were monuments to a belief that no longer worked. And as 1945 approached, one final truth became clear. The Americans were not fighting for islands. They were fighting for time, and Japan had lost it. By early 1945, the silence on the bypassed islands had become permanent. What once felt temporary now felt final. The Japanese soldiers still alive understood that no rescue was coming. The war had moved beyond them, and the world they had trained for no longer existed. On Jaluit Mill and other isolated positions, commanders faced a grim duty. They had to keep men alive with almost nothing. They rationed hope as carefully as food. Each decision felt like a delay, not a solution. Rice was gone. Fish stocks were low. Rainwater became the main source of drinking water. Men boiled anything that looked edible: roots, leaves, insects. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it poisoned them. Medical officers worked without medicine. They cleaned wounds with salt water. They wrapped injuries with torn uniforms. Infection became the real enemy. It moved slowly, quietly, and without mercy, yet discipline still held. Men continued to salute. They continued to follow orders. They continued to stand watch over empty seas. This discipline was not enforced by fear. It was enforced by belief. A belief shaped long before the war began. A belief that duty did not end simply because hope had vanished, but belief could not stop the body from failing. Weight fell away. Eyes sank deeper into faces. Voices grew weaker. Even standing became difficult. Patrols shortened. Watches were reduced. Movement slowed. Time became heavy. Days no longer brought change. They only brought less. Meanwhile, far away, American forces were planning their next steps. The success at Kwajalein had proven something powerful. Fortresses could be ignored. The enemy could be isolated instead of destroyed. This idea became a pattern. Island after island was selected, not for how strong it was, but for how useful it could be. If an island offered airfields, harbors, or range, it mattered. If it did not, it was bypassed. This was not cruelty, it was calculation. Every landing saved cost lives. Every avoided battle preserved strength. The war would be won not by fighting everywhere, but by choosing carefully. American planners understood something Japan had not fully accepted. War is movement, control the sea, control the air, and fixed positions lose meaning. Back on the isolated islands, Japanese officers began to sense this truth. Some wrote in diaries, others spoke quietly to trusted men. They admitted what they could never say publicly: the fortress strategy had failed, the walls were strong. The guns were powerful, the men were brave, but the idea behind them was wrong. A fortress only matters if the enemy needs it. The Americans did not. As months passed, some garrisons attempted desperate actions. Small boats were built from scrap. Men tried to reach nearby islands. Most attempts failed. The sea was unforgiving. American patrols watched the waters. Those who returned came back weaker than before. Eventually, attempts stopped. Energy was too precious to waste. Tokyo's silence became absolute. Radios no longer worked. Batteries died. Messages went unanswered. The empire that had promised glory could no longer speak. This silence did something worse than hunger. It erased purpose. For soldiers raised on the idea of decisive battle, this was unbearable. They had trained to give everything in one moment. Instead, they were losing everything slowly. Some officers held final ceremonies. They spoke of honor, of endurance. Of service, they did not speak of victory. The war had taken that word away. On Kwajalein, American troops moved freely. What had once been a battlefield was now a functioning base. Runways were busy, ships came and went. Supplies stacked high. It was hard for some Americans to imagine the suffering happening just a few islands away. The war felt active. Progress felt constant, yet intelligence reports told the story clearly. The bypassed islands were finished. They no longer posed a threat. They no longer influenced operations. They no longer mattered strategically. The American strategy had achieved its goal. Japan's fortress system was neutralized without being attacked. This success reshaped how officers thought about defense and offense. Static strength lost value, mobility gained importance. Flexibility became essential. The lesson was clear. Do not fight where the enemy is strongest. Fight where the enemy is weakest. Or better yet, do not fight at all. This thinking would shape future wars. For the Japanese soldiers left behind, these lessons arrived too late. They lived inside the consequences of certainty. They had trusted a plan that assumed the enemy would behave predictably. The enemy did not, and that refusal had changed everything. By mid-1945, many garrisons were barely alive. Men lay in bunkers too weak to move. Some died quietly in their sleep. Others held onto rifles they could no longer lift. Yet even then, surrender did not come. Not because they believed they would win, but because surrender had never been part of the plan. The fortress strategy had prepared them for one ending: death in battle, not survival without purpose. This was the cruelest twist of all. The Americans had not only defeated the strategy, they had removed the meaning from the sacrifice it demanded. As the war drew closer to Japan itself, the bypassed islands faded from attention. They became footnotes. Forgotten places with forgotten men, but their story mattered, because it showed what happens when certainty replaces imagination. Japan had built walls and believed in them completely. The Americans had looked at those walls and simply walked around them. That single choice saved thousands of lives, and it condemned thousands of others to a slow, silent end. As the Pacific War approached its final chapters, the age of the fortress was dying. Concrete and steel could not stop movement. Guns could not force an enemy to fight. Only imagination could shape the battlefield. And Japan had run out of it. By the summer of 1945, the bypassed islands no longer felt like parts of a war. They felt like forgotten worlds. Nature moved in slowly, covering bunkers with vines, filling trenches with sand, and reclaiming paths once walked by armed patrols. The soldiers who remained were no longer thinking in terms of months or years. They thought in hours. On some islands, officers kept lists of the living. Each day, the list grew shorter. Death rarely came with noise. It came with weakness, fever. Infection, hunger. Men died quietly. Those who survived learned to move as little as possible. Every step burned energy they could not replace. Conversation faded. Silence became normal. Still, rituals continued. Still, rituals continued. Morning roll calls, guard rotations, salutes, even when there was no one left to see. This discipline was not pointless to them. It was the last thing that made them soldiers. Across the ocean, Japan itself was under growing pressure. Cities burned, supplies vanished. The war was turning inward. The empire that had once promised expansion now struggled to survive. The bypassed garrisons were no longer discussed in strategy meetings. They were assumed lost. American commanders, meanwhile, reflected on what the island campaign had revealed. The decision to bypass fortresses had not been obvious at first. It had required trust in intelligence, confidence in movement, and the courage to reject tradition. That courage had paid off. The Pacific War had changed shape. Instead of smashing through every defense, the Americans flowed around them. Instead of facing every gun, they targeted control points. Instead of measuring victory by territory alone, they measured it by relevance. An island that could not affect the war did not need to be conquered. This approach saved time, it saved resources. Most importantly, it saved lives. Officers wrote after-action reports that emphasized this lesson. They spoke of speed, of flexibility, of refusing to fight battles chosen by the enemy. These reports would shape future military thinking long after the war ended. But for the men on the bypassed islands, none of this mattered. They lived in the shadow of a decision made far away, a decision that had erased them from the battlefield. Some soldiers accepted this quietly, others struggled with anger. Not at the enemy, but at the plan that had placed them here. They had been told they were essential. They had been told their sacrifice would matter. Now they understood it did not. That realization cut deeper than hunger. In rare moments of strength, some men gathered and spoke openly. They shared memories. They spoke of families they would never see again. They spoke of a war that no longer needed them. There was no bitterness in their voices, only sadness. As weeks passed, storms swept across the islands. Rain flooded bunkers, wind tore at damaged structures. Weak men shivered in soaked uniforms. Some died during these storms. Others survived by sheer stubbornness. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, many bypassed garrisons did not know immediately. Radios were dead. No planes came, no ships arrived. The war ended without telling them. Days later, American patrols began visiting some islands. They came cautiously, they expected resistance. What they found instead shocked them. Thin men, hollow eyes, weak hands still gripping rifles. Some Japanese soldiers were too weak to stand. Others saluted out of habit even as they collapsed. The Americans provided food and medical aid. Many lives were saved, many were not. The fortresses that once promised glory were now scenes of quiet tragedy. Officers on both sides understood what they were seeing. This was not defeat by force. This was defeat by irrelevance. The Japanese soldiers had not failed in courage. They had not failed in discipline. They had failed because their strategy assumed the enemy would behave a certain way. The enemy did not. That difference changed everything. In the years after the war, military thinkers around the world studied the Pacific Campaign closely. They focused on mobility, on intelligence, on the danger of fixed defenses. Kwajalein became a case study. Not because of how hard it was fought, but because of what it revealed. A fortress is only powerful if it controls movement. Once movement bypasses it, the fortress becomes a burden. This lesson echoed far beyond the Pacific. It influenced planning in future conflicts. It reshaped how nations thought about defense. Walls and bunkers lost their mythical status. Flexibility replaced rigidity. Imagination replaced certainty. Looking back, historians often pointed to one moment as the turning point. Not the bombardment, not the landings, but the decision made over a map. The decision to ignore the strongest points and strike where the enemy felt safe. That decision did not just win a battle. It ended an era. The age of the unbreakable fortress died quietly, surrounded by concrete walls that no longer mattered. And as the world moved on, the lesson remained. Never assume the enemy must fight the way you expect, because the moment that assumption breaks, everything else follows. After the war ended, the story of the bypassed islands did not spread quickly. There were no dramatic photographs. No single moment that captured attention. The events unfolded slowly, and history often prefers loud endings. But among military planners, the lesson was impossible to ignore. They studied maps of the Marshall Islands again and again. They traced the ring of Japanese fortresses. They followed the American fleet's path as it curved past them. What they saw was not just a victory, they saw a warning. Japan had invested enormous effort into static power, concrete, steel, guns that could fire for miles. Garrisons trained to hold ground at any cost. All of it depended on one assumption, that the enemy would come. When the enemy chose not to, everything collapsed. This realization forced armies around the world to rethink defense. Fixed positions were no longer enough. Even the strongest wall could be rendered useless by speed and intelligence. The lesson was simple: control movement, not space. Officers began to speak about war in new terms. Instead of asking how to stop an attack, they asked how to avoid being forced into one. Instead of planning for decisive battles, they planned for decisive choices. Kwajalein was no longer just an island. It became a symbol, a reminder that the battlefield is shaped by decisions, not by structures. For Japan, the cost of this realization was devastating. Thousands of soldiers had been placed on islands meant to be unbreakable. Those men were trained to die fighting. They were not trained to be ignored. That mismatch destroyed morale. Many survivors later spoke of the same feeling, not fear, not anger, emptiness. They had waited for an enemy who never arrived. They had prepared for a battle that had already passed them by. This psychological collapse was something Japanese planners had never considered. Their doctrine focused on courage and endurance. It did not account for irrelevance, but irrelevance is deadly in war. An army that cannot influence events ceases to matter, no matter how brave its soldiers are. The Americans understood this instinctively. Their approach did not seek to destroy every enemy unit. It sought to remove the enemy's ability to shape the war. Once that ability was gone, victory followed naturally. In the years after 1945, this thinking spread beyond naval warfare. Air power adopted similar ideas, so did ground forces. The goal shifted from breaking the enemy's strength to breaking the enemy's options. Limit choices. Force bad decisions. Avoid unnecessary fights. This was maneuver warfare in its purest form. It did not rely on overwhelming force alone. It relied on intelligence and imagination. Looking back, some historians asked whether Japan could have adapted. Could the fortress strategy have been changed? Could mobile reserves have made a difference? Perhaps. But doctrine is hard to abandon once it feels proven. Tarawa had convinced Japan that Americans would always attack. That single belief shaped years of planning. It felt logical. It felt safe. And it was wrong. The danger of certainty is not that it lacks logic. The danger is that it refuses to question itself. The bypassed islands became silent evidence of that danger. They stood for years after the war ended, rusting slowly, visited only by weather and memory. Many were never rebuilt. They had no purpose. For the men who survived those islands, returning home was difficult. They carried the weight of a strange survival. They had not been defeated in battle. They had not been victorious either. They had simply endured. That endurance came with questions that had no answers. Why were we left? Why did the enemy not fight us? What was our sacrifice for? Those questions lingered. Meanwhile, American veterans remembered Kwajalein differently. They remembered speed, organization, surprise, a victory that felt almost unreal compared to earlier battles. They understood they had witnessed a turning point, not because of bloodshed but because of choice, the choice to fight differently. As decades passed, the fortress strategy faded from military thinking. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder that strength without flexibility invites disaster. Engineers still built defenses, armies still fortified positions. But no one believed walls alone could decide a war anymore. That belief had died in the Marshall Islands, and yet the lesson remains relevant. In every era there are assumptions that feel unshakable. There are plans built on certainty. There are leaders convinced they understand how the enemy thinks. History shows how dangerous that confidence can be. Japan believed the Americans would attack head-on. The Americans chose another path. That choice changed the Pacific War. And it brings the story toward its final conclusion. Because beyond battles and strategy, the bypassed islands reveal something deeper. War is not only about strength, it is about imagination. Those who can imagine alternatives shape the battlefield. Those who cannot become trapped by their own plans. The Japanese fortresses were strong, but they were inflexible. And in a war defined by movement, inflexibility was fatal. The final lesson waits just ahead. When historians look back at the Pacific War, they often search for moments of overwhelming violence. Massive landings, endless bombardments, beaches soaked in blood. Those moments matter, but they do not tell the whole story. Some of the most important victories did not come from fighting harder. They came from thinking differently. The bypass of Japan's island fortresses was one of those moments. At Kwajalein, the United States did not just capture land. It broke an idea that had guided Japanese planning for years. The belief that strength meant immobility. The belief that a fortress once built forced the enemy to obey its logic. That belief died quietly. No dramatic surrender, no final charge, just silence on islands that no longer mattered. For Japan, the loss was not only military, it was cultural. The fortress plan was rooted in older thinking, a belief in decisive stands, in honor through endurance, in forcing the enemy to meet strength with strength. But modern war did not reward that belief. Modern war rewarded movement. Admiral Nimitz understood something simple and dangerous. An enemy who cannot move cannot respond. An enemy who cannot respond will eventually collapse even if no shot is fired. By skipping the outer islands, the Americans removed Japan's ability to shape the fight. The fortresses still existed. The guns were still loaded. The soldiers were still disciplined. None of it mattered. They were no longer part of the war. This realization reshaped everything that followed. After the Marshalls, the pattern repeated. Islands were isolated instead of assaulted. Supply lines were cut. Garrisons were left to fade away. Each time the same result followed. Less American blood, less time wasted, more pressure on Japan's core defenses. By 1945, the Imperial Navy was broken. Its air power was shattered. Its supply system was collapsing, and many of its strongest island positions had never fired a shot at an invading force. They had been neutralized by irrelevance. This is why Kwajalein matters. Not because it was the largest battle, not because it was the bloodiest, but because it revealed a truth. A fortress only matters if the enemy chooses to attack it. The men left behind on the bypassed islands paid the highest price for that truth. They were trained to fight bravely, they were prepared to die quickly, instead they were left to survive slowly. Hunger became the enemy, disease followed. Morale collapsed as months passed with no orders, no supplies, no purpose. Some soldiers kept discipline until the end. They saluted officers who could no longer command. They cleaned weapons they would never fire. They stood watch over beaches no one would land on. Others lost hope. The war had moved on without them. This quiet suffering rarely appears in war films or textbooks. It lacks spectacle, but it reveals the full cost of rigid thinking. A strategy that cannot adapt does not just fail, it traps its own people. On the American side, the victory reinforced a growing confidence in flexibility. Commanders learned that victory did not require destroying every enemy position. It required removing the enemy's choices. This idea would later influence conflicts far beyond the Pacific. It shaped how modern militaries think about mobility, intelligence, and decision-making. Today, students of military history still study the marshals. Not to memorize dates or unit names, but to understand how assumptions can become vulnerabilities. Japan assumed the Americans would fight a certain way. The Americans refused. That refusal changed the war. And it carries a lesson that reaches far beyond history. In any conflict, whether military, political, or personal, strength alone is not enough. Plans built on certainty can fail if the world changes around them. Flexibility is power. Imagination is survival. The bypassed islands stand as silent reminders of that truth. Coral and concrete remain. Rusted guns face empty seas. Bunkers crumble under vines and rain. They were once symbols of confidence. Now they are warnings. The Pacific War ended decades ago, but its lessons remain alive. Not in museums alone, but in the choices leaders make when faced with uncertainty. Do they cling to old plans, or do they look for new paths? At Kwajalein, the United States chose the second option. Japan did not. History recorded the outcome, and that is where this story truly ends. Not with explosions or speeches, but with a quiet understanding. Wars are not won by the strongest walls. They are won by the minds willing to walk around them.